This lesson is what I call kanji trivia. I love this lesson. It's so much fun. I gotta be honest, this is all this stuff that I wanted to put down. Couldn't quite figure out which unit it should go into, so I made a separate unit about kanji. So there's a collection of different videos here. The only thread that links them all is they have to do with kanji. I have color code them to try and keep things a little straight in your mind. And the subtitle of this unit is Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Kanji, but Were Afraid to Ask. All kinds of various trivia about kanji that you wouldn't otherwise learn in the classroom. So we're going to start with types of kanji. This is today's video, this particular video. There are traditionally 6 categories of kanji. This originates from China, goes way far back, and actually the fact that these ideas originate in China cause a little bit of problem when it gets transferred over to Japanese, but we'll work our way around those as best we can. So here are the 6 different types, and I'm going to go through each one in subsequent slides. But to give you a quick overview, there are pictograms, shokemoji, simple ideograms, shijimoji, ideogrammatic compounds, kaimoji, phonosemantic compounds, keiseimoji, derivative cognates, tenjumoji, and phonetic loan characters, kashakumoji. This is actually the kind of information that we don't talk about very much in Japanese studies, but it is the kind of thing when you go home and your parents ask you, so what have you learned? How do those Chinese characters work? That kind of thing. This is the type of information that will make those explanations to the novices in the outside world, outside of Japanese studies, a little bit easier. Let's start with pictograms. There are roughly 600 Chinese characters that are pictograms. Only 600, not that many. A lot of people think that almost all Chinese characters are pictograms, but really they're not. We'll be talking about the larger categories in a couple more minutes. So what do I mean by a pictogram? A pictogram is a stylized drawing of the object that the character represents. These 600 or so characters are the oldest characters, the oldest kanji. They go way, way back to about the 12th century BCE. These pictograms became progressively, over time, more stylized, and I'll show you that on the next slide. And eventually they lost their pictographic flavor, especially as they made the transition from oracle bone script, which we're going to be talking about when we look at calligraphy, to the seal script of the Eastern Zhou, but also to a lesser extent in the transition to the clerical script of the Han Dynasty. So what do I mean by progressively more stylized? A lot of people assume that the characters are supposed to look just like that thing that it represents, but then when they look at the character at the kanji today, they think, I don't really see how that corresponds to the actual object. So here is a chart. I'll be honest, I got this from a children's dictionary, but I think it does a great job of showing us, for the most part, these are all pictograms. So on the top row, we see a drawing, a simple drawing of an object. And then on the next row down, we see an early version of the kanji that represents that object. The next row down is a more stylized version of that kanji, but we're still looking at characters that date way back, way before Japanese history. We're looking at early Chinese history. The next row down again, an even more stylized example of what those kanji look like. And then finally the white row is what that kanji looks like today in standard calligraphy. So just as an example, we have the sun, and then it becomes this kind of hexagram, and then a circle, and then what looks like a cup almost, and eventually this kanji. Likewise, we have the moon, which becomes a bit of a triangle and then a little bit more rounded and eventually ends up looking like this. Now there's a couple exceptions in this chart that aren't quite representative of a thing but more of a concept. For example, here we have an intersection that becomes the character for going, iku. But for the most part, you get the idea from this chart how those simple drawings of objects slowly evolved to become these ideogrammatic, or rather the pictograms of modern day kanji. Okay, so that's category 1. Category 2, simple ideograms. This category expresses an abstract idea, not a concrete idea, that's what we were just looking at, but an abstract idea through an iconic form, including iconic modification of pictographic characters. In the examples below, low numerals are represented by the appropriate number of strokes, directions by an iconic indication above and below a line, and the parts of a tree by marking the appropriate part of a pictogram of a tree. So, for example, this one line represents the number 1. That's an abstract idea. 2 lines represent the concept, the abstraction of 2. 3 lines, the abstraction of 3. A line here above a lower line represents the abstraction of something that is above or up. And likewise, a line here below a tall, longer line indicates the abstraction of something that's below or lower. Here we have the kanji for tree, ki, and then at the base of it, another line representing the base or the root of something. Now, you may be looking at this and thinking, oh, but that's the kanji for book, for hon, and it is, but that kanji has more than one meaning. Traditionally, its meaning was the root or the origin of something. The use of that kanji for the word book in Japanese is a relatively modern phenomenon. And then finally, we have a long line at the top here above a shorter line in the middle. This is again the character, the kanji for keys, with the addition of a long line on the top, and that means the apex of something. So these are abstractions. What's next? Ideogrammatic compounds. Okay. An ideogrammatic compound also is called an associative compound or a logical aggregate. These are 2 or more pictographic or ideographic characters combined to suggest a third meaning. So in that previous slide, we were looking at simple concepts, simple ideograms. And now we're going to look at combinations. So, for example, this character originally meant to arrive. Nowadays, we look at it and we think of it as a character that means each, but try not to think about that right now. Originally, way back in Chinese history, it meant to arrive. The oracle bone form of that compound was very similar to the modern glyph and shows this character, which was representative of a foot, and this or this, which was a walled object. And so the meaning of arrive is suggested as a foot crosses a doorstep. An easier example to understand is this character here, which is a combination of the sun on the left and the moon on the right, and that means bright. So here's some examples of some other ideogrammatic compounds. I'm hoping that you know most of these characters. If we have 2 trees, it means a grove. If we have 3 trees, it means a forest. If we have a rice paddy and strength, we have strength in the fields and therefore man or male. If we have a division and a sword, we end up with a division. If we have a ceiling that is, there's the ceiling, that is big, it is the heavens. If we have a girl or a woman with a child, that's a good thing. If we have a hand, and this was originally a character that was used for hand. I know it's not used that way anymore, but it was in ancient Chinese history, and a mouth, hand to mouth, right. In other words, we use our right hand to feed ourselves. And a hand and work, that's left, because we work with our left hands. The next category are phonosemantic compound characters. So I'm going to bust a myth right now. Most people don't realize that this is the lion's share of kanji out there in the world. Indeed, these kanji form the majority of Chinese characters by far. Over 90% of the kanji that we use are phonosemantic compound characters. So what are these? These are created by combining a component with approximately the correct pronunciation, and this is where things get tricky between China and Japan, but it still works to some extent, with a component which supplies the element of meaning. So in other words, half of your kanji is hinting at the reading of the kanji, in this case the onyomi, and the other half is hinting at the meaning of the character. So for example, this is the water radical. In this kanji, over here on the right hand side, the radical gives us a hint about the meaning, something to do with water. The right hand side is the phonetic component. This character, this kanji alone, you may not know it, but it's pronounced yo, and it means sheep, as in the animal. Okay. So the onyomi of that is yo, and the onyomi of this character likewise is yo. So when you look at this character, you think, okay, we've got two parts here. We've got water on the left, we've got the sheep on the right. Does that mean that the character is representative of something that's supposed to be a sheep in water? No, absolutely not. The sheep part only gives us the reading, not the meaning. The left-hand part tells us that the character has something to do with water or liquid. In this case, this is the character for ocean. Let's look at another one. Here we have the character for day, and here we have the character for temple, as in a Buddhist temple. Now this character, one of its readings is ji, one of its onyomi is ji. So if we put a day together with this reading ji, we get this character, which I'm hoping you know, that means time. Of course it can be read toki, but it's onyomi. Toki is a kunyomi. Its onyomi is ji. So in this character, just like the one above, the left-hand side hints at what it could mean. Certainly doesn't tell us, but it hints. And the right-hand side tells us how it's read, or at least hints at how it's read. Finally, let's look at one more. This is go, as in Nihongo no go. The left-hand side tells us it has something to do with speech. The right-hand side tells us that the reading is probably go, and indeed it is. The full character is go, and of course it means language. Isn't that cool? In case you ever wondered about how your native speaker friends sometimes can look at a kanji and guess how it's read, that's how they're doing it. Even if they can't tell you that's how they're doing it, that's how they're doing it. So this is sort of a miracle that this works across the Chinese-Japanese platform, as I was just saying earlier, at least for the onyomi of a character. But it does, and it does work even better in Chinese, in case you were wondering. The next category is really minor, but I felt I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. These are the derivative cognates. This is a classification that's purely of historical value. It's the least understood of the 6 principles of character formation. It may refer to characters which have similar meanings and often the same etymological root, but which have diverged in pronunciation and meaning. So for example, this character here, which is read gaku, or can be read gaku amongst other readings, and originally had the meaning of music, now can also be read raku, in which case it means something that's enjoyable. Really two dramatically different readings and meanings. In Japanese, where these characters have multiple meanings, we think, well, yeah, okay, that happens, because it doesn't happen, it happens relatively frequently when you get deeper into Japanese. But in Chinese, it's really rare for one character to have more than one meaning. Sorry, more than one reading and more than one meaning. The last category are phonetic loan characters, and we're going to be looking at these in a couple different contexts. These are characters that are borrowed to write another homophonous or near homophonous morpheme. They, as I said, are a kind of small category. They are minor compared to the others that we've looked at. They have their origins in China, and the new usage was borrowed from China by Japan. So we'll look at a Chinese example. For example, this character, yo, which is read yo, originally meant right hand or right, but it was borrowed to write another word, to write the abstract word yo, again or moreover. It's easy to write, it was only 2 strokes, people thought, yeah, sure, I'll do it. In modern usage, the character yo exclusively represents that later meaning, again. And now this character, which adds the mouth radical to a variant of hand, represents yo, or right hand. I know, it's a little hard to wrap your brain around. Think of it a little bit like people who write the numeral 4 instead of writing FOR in English. Now, these categories you can find sometimes in Japanese kanji dictionaries. Nelson's doesn't list them, but some Japanese kanji dictionaries, as we'll see, will indicate what type of kanji a character is. And so, for example, in Morohashi's dictionary, which we're going to be looking at in another couple lessons, some of the kanji, not all of them, are listed with their particular category. I'll show you an example. Here is the entry for the kanji 10, or sky, and it tells us that this is a kai emoji. It is oki and ichi together, and that forms a particular kanji. So if you see this indicator, kaiji, that will tell you, okay, this is going to give you that particular category within this system. That's it for this particular video. On to the next.